Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the COVID-19 Vaccination Parent and Youth Information Session. We're pleased to have parents and youth from throughout Waterloo region joining us tonight. Thank you all for attending. My name is Jonathan Mall. I'm a manager in the Healthy Living and Foundational Standards Division of Public Health. I manage the Youth and Young Adult Health team. And joining me this evening is Carly Tithicott. She is a Health Promotion and Research Analyst in Public Health. Carly will be co-facilitating the session with me by helping with the question and answer period. She will also be identifying where clinics are available locally for youth, and she'll be going through the registration process and booking process to get a vaccine. We also have a couple other public health colleagues helping behind the scenes during the session. So before we proceed, I'm going to outline some details about how the session will run. Just to let you know, this session is a webinar format. So you will just be able to see the panelists. Attendee cameras are not visible and attendees are muted. We will be recording this presentation to post on our Public Health YouTube channel for those who are not able to attend the live session this evening. And after Dr. Grinrod's presentation, we have a dedicated time for her to answer any of your questions that weren't covered in her presentation. And if you do have a question, you might have questions right now, or you might have questions throughout the presentation. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you could use that button to, you click that button and then you could type in your questions, and that's where we will be looking for the questions that you're asking to answer in the question and answer period. So just to go over a little bit about the purpose of the session, we'll be focusing on COVID-19 vaccines. And as most of you know, the COVID-19 vaccine rollout has been well underway, and there's no shortage of information about the vaccines on the news, on the internet, and from family and friends. And with the overload of information, this can raise additional questions about vaccine effectiveness and safety. And we've opened this session up to both parents and youth. I have two daughters in elementary school, and they have many questions about whether or not they can receive the vaccination. How does the vaccine work? How effective is the vaccine? I imagine many parents are receiving those kinds of questions and more. This session is an opportunity for both parents and youth to ask questions and get the information you need to make an informed decision about the vaccination for yourself and for your child. So just a little bit of scope about the content. So some of the things that we won't be covering will be things like what will be required when students attend school in the fall. We're still awaiting direction from the province and the ministry, so we won't be covering policies and guidance for returning to school in September. We also won't be covering the details related to the reopening of the province. So, we won't be covering things like when can I get my hair cut or eaten in a restaurant. Just wanted to make sure that was clear. Tonight, we are excited to have an expert in the field that will provide reliable information. Dr. Kelly Grinrod will be speaking about vaccine safety and effectiveness in youth. Dr. Grinrod is an associate professor of pharmacy at the University of Waterloo. She's the pharmacy lead for Waterloo Region's Vaccine Task Force and is helping to run a large vaccine clinic at the University of Waterloo School of Pharmacy. Dr. Grinrod will first provide a presentation, and I expect that will answer many of your questions, but then we will have a question and answer period for any additional questions that you may have. So thank you for joining us this evening, Dr. Grinrod. I'm now going to pass it over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. To give you a bit of background on myself, I'm a pharmacist. I've been a pharmacist for 20 years. I spent a lot of time working on public health areas, vaccinations, the opioid crisis, things like that. I'm also a mom. I have kids who are 9 and 11. So I'm going through many of the same questions and needing the same information that you are. They're actually playing Minecraft in another room. They got unlimited Minecraft for the duration of this webinar. So we're all kind of going through the same things. Something else I want to mention too is that I do not take funding or receive funding from pharmaceutical companies. My position with the region as the pharmacy lead is actually an unpaid position. I'm a professor, that's my position, that's my work. And my role in the region is to help the pharmacies in town liaise with public health to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So for those that need a bit of context or background on that, that's where I'm coming from with this presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide deck comes from a group that I've been working with called COVID-19 to Zero. It's a collaborative of physicians, pediatrics, infectious disease, public health, family medicine, as well as nurses, pharmacists, and others, trying to find reliable information or ways to share reliable information with people who need it as they're making decisions about the vaccine. Next slide. So just to be clear, the slides were submitted yesterday. They're up to date as of June 15th, as you can imagine. It used to be with other conditions like osteoporosis or hypertension. If something came out in, like, say, April of this year, we'd say brand new, it's in April. But with the pandemic, you know, something from 3 days ago was old news already. It's moving really quickly. So this presentation is updated today, June 16th, and the slides were made on June 15th yesterday. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get through an overview of what I'm going to talk about. The first thing is just to talk about why we're getting vaccinated, give you some information about the vaccines, the types of vaccines that are available and how they work. We're going to talk about real-world effectiveness as well, safety and side effects, and then some frequently asked questions that I'm often getting. And I've had a number of questions sent to me as well to make sure that I cover the majority of what people are wanting to know about. I'm also going to focus a bit on easing needle fears. We've just gone through 1 week of a lot of teens coming through the clinics, lots and lots of needle fears. So I just want to give you some strategies if that's something that's a challenge in your house, or for dose 2 if you've already had dose 1. And then we'll do the Q&A. Next slide, please. So Ontario is moving out of the third wave, and you can see here, you know, this is data coming from Canada. This is very much what's happened in Ontario as well. Waterloo, we're struggling in Waterloo. Our cases are high. We're struggling with the Delta variant. The Delta variant is the variant that was discovered in India. It's more infectious. It appears to be making people a bit sicker. So it spreads easier. It might make you sicker. And we certainly have it in the community. We're really struggling with it. So one of the questions is, can we get ahead of a fourth wave now? You know, we've come through the third wave. Now with the immunization campaign, the real goal in the next few weeks is to get as many vaccines out there as we can to try and head off a potential fourth wave that would be largely attributable to this Delta variant. Next slide, please. So as all of us know, we're still living with COVID. You know, we're living with the inability to see one another. I haven't seen my parents in a couple of years. My parents haven't seen my kids in a couple of years. They live in another province. It's impacting school. Our kids have not gone back to school. We joke that I have a daughter in grade 3. She's a grade 3 dropout. You know, she just quit attending online school a couple of weeks ago because it just wasn't working for her. We're all living through this. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about vaccinations. That's really what one of the goals of vaccinations is to get past this period of COVID, to get back into normal life. Next slide, please. But people have questions, and this is completely normal. So having concerns about the vaccine is natural, and you deserve a chance to have your questions answered. So here's some of the concerns that I'm hearing. I'm not at risk for COVID. So I don't know anybody around me who's had COVID. I don't think I could get COVID. And this is a common thing we even hear from people working in hospital. When people are getting COVID or testing positive, they can't believe they tested positive because they really didn't think they were at risk. Vaccine was rushed, so I'm going to talk about why the vaccines were able to come out as quickly as they did and what that actually means for just science in general in the future. The need for long-term data. So I'm actually going to tell you what long-term data we do need and what people think we need, but what we already actually have. And then, is the vaccine safe? That's a big question. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide because I also am often asked about, you know, what about, you know, I'm vaccinated, but what about people around me who aren't getting it? You know, it makes people angry. They got vaccinated, but others are not. Is that fair? And actually, one thing I've noticed I vaccinate, I work in a vaccine clinic, I mix doses and I vaccinate. And the one thing we're seeing is people are coming through right now. We're still getting a lot of first doses, and they just needed time. There's usually something that tipped them over. So you can see early on last summer in July, before we had a vaccine that was available, before we knew about Pfizer and Mrna, these were not words we were saying, you know, in everyday conversation, less than half of people said they were willing, in Canada, said they were willing to get a vaccination the first time this was offered to them. As we went into the fall, the number dropped a bit, kind of hovered around 40%. Into December, we started seeing shipments of the first doses coming in. They started going into the ICU workers, the long-term care homes. We were seeing pictures of this, not only airplanes bringing them in, but pictures of the first long-term care home resident to get the vaccines and so on and so forth. And what you can actually see is generally when we're being surveyed, people are increasingly comfortable with the idea of the vaccine. And the most recent one, that I should actually say May 2021, 88% of Canadians said that they would be willing to get a vaccine right away. That's a very high number. And so when I talk with people, when they come and sit in the chair with me and I'm about to vaccinate them, especially the people who got first doses, who are maybe eligible 3 months ago, but they're just coming for the first time now, and I ask them, so what's changed? Why are you here? A lot of them, it's because of family pressure. They say, my kids told me if I want to see my grandkids, I have to get the vaccine, or every member of my family got it and I was the last one, and I just thought, well, you know what, it's time, I have to go and do it. Or I really just want to take a trip, and now that I'm learning more about people around me got it, it seems safe, I'm okay with it. Sometimes before I even put the vaccine in, we just stop and we have a conversation so people feel comfortable. And all of these things are perfectly normal. So a lot of folks just need time to get information and feel comfortable with the decision. Next slide. So I love this slide. I put this up every time I present. And this was from yesterday. I'm sure we're over 30 million now. So around 29 to 30 million doses have been administered in Canada. If you look at the map in terms of coverage, you see this is first dose coverage: BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. They're all above 70%. Quebec is almost at 80%. In the northern territories, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, they're at 80% or higher. Really high uptake already of first doses. So in Canada, 74% of the eligible population has had at least one dose, which is 65% of all Canadians in total, including kids who are not yet eligible. So we're seeing huge uptake. If you look at the table on the left here, this is equivalent to millions of doses. BC, 4 million doses. Alberta, 3.4. Ontario, 11.5 million doses have been out there. So huge numbers of vaccines have gone out. Next slide. So let's get to some of the frequently asked questions that you've got and facts about the COVID vaccine. Next slide. I always like to start with these images. We created these images at the University of Waterloo to help people understand how these vaccines are working. So a good analogy for the mRNA vaccines, these are Pfizer and Moderna. Pfizer and Moderna are the mRNA vaccines. The mRNA vaccine is like a most wanted poster that tells your body how to recognize COVID-19. It can't and won't change your DNA. Next slide. So if we look at this image here that tells you how it works, let's start at the top left. So for number one, the mRNA vaccine is injected, and mRNA cannot change your DNA. You have mRNA in your body right now. If you've ever eaten a steak, you've eaten some mRNA. This is just how proteins are made. It's instructions for making proteins. So it's injected into your body. It does not change your DNA. Number two, your cells read the mRNA instructions and they start building the same kind of spike proteins that COVID-19 has. These spike proteins that your cells are making are harmless. So often with vaccinations, what we do is we'll grow the virus and then we'll kill the virus and then we'll maybe inject it and so your body can recognize it. The really amazing thing about the mRNA vaccines is they teach your body how to make a tiny piece of a protein on the surface of the virus so your body can recognize it, like a most wanted poster. And then it goes away. We don't have to give you the virus. We're not injecting you with the virus. So it's really interesting. It's a real shift in how we've made vaccines. Much faster to make vaccines this way, much more efficient. And apparently what we're learning, very effective. Now, the thing is, the mRNA then dissolves. mRNA is not very stable. So most of the research, they've been researching this for the last 40 years. Most of the research in the last 10 years has been about how do you get it to be stable enough to get it into people's bodies so that your body can use it to make the spike proteins before it dissolves and goes away. And so that research had been done for when we needed it during this pandemic, which is why we're seeing it now. So one of the questions I often get is, this research was rushed. What people don't realize is this research has been ongoing for decades. It just turned out that during this pandemic, the research was ready. And the researchers who were developing this are now actually turning it to research cancer and HIV vaccines and Ebola and Zika. So it's really, really interesting and exciting and quite promising. So if we go to number 3, your immune system sees the spike protein and starts building a defense, and it launches an attack. You may feel some fatigue, aches, or a fever at this point. It's your immune system learning. Number 4, now your body can recognize the COVID-19 spike protein and fight COVID-19 effectively. You're building immunity. Next slide. So the 2 mRNA vaccines that we have in Canada are Pfizer and Moderna. We consider them to be essentially interchangeable. They are pretty much the same. From a patient perspective, how they work, how effective they are, they're the same. They're a little bit different for how we handle them. Pfizer's a little bit more difficult to handle. It requires those super cold temperatures to keep it stable enough so we can actually get into bodies. With Moderna, they actually found ways to keep it more stable at warmer temperatures, so regular freezer, longer in the fridge, which means it's much easier to work with. But other than that, there aren't really differences between the 2 of them. So they're both about 95% effective for protecting you from having symptomatic illness. Symptomatic illness means that you test positive for COVID and you have symptoms. Could be a cough, it could be a headache, it could be a fever, whatever, but you test positive and you have symptoms. So give or take, if you had 100 people who would have otherwise gotten COVID, they were exposed, got COVID, but if you vaccinate them, only 5 of those people might get a mild to moderate symptomatic COVID infection, but 95 wouldn't get that at all. The other thing to note is almost 100% of those people are also protected from severe illness, hospitalization, and death. And what sets apart COVID from a bad flu season or even a bad cold season is the fact that in such alarming numbers, it causes severe illness, hospitalization, and death. So we need a vaccine specifically for severe illness, hospitalization, and death. It's nice to have a vaccine to prevent more mild symptoms. You know, that's a bonus. But what we really needed was a vaccine for severe illness, hospitalization, and death. And these 2 vaccines seem to protect almost all people who get fully vaccinated from severe illness, hospitalization, and death. It's also important to note that the trials for both of these vaccines were very diverse. It included lots of people from lots of different communities, Black community, Indigenous community, Hispanic community. They did actually run additional statistical tests to confirm that there were no differences in how people responded in terms of side effects or benefits and protection across any of these groups. We wouldn't necessarily expect that, but you know, certain populations might have a more common genetic trait that is present in other populations as well. So that's why we like to have diverse trials, to make sure we get all sorts of different genetic backgrounds and there don't appear to be differences. We also found, very interestingly, that the studies found that older people were similarly well protected to younger people, which is very unusual for a vaccine and just speaks to how effective these vaccines are. So for a lot of healthcare people, when this information came out, I mean, for me, this was when I think I cried. I cried when the planes landed and brought the vaccines, because these were not just vaccines for the pandemic, they were really remarkably effective vaccines for the pandemic. Next slide. So let's shift quickly to viral vector vaccines. We won't be giving viral vector vaccines to kids, but many of the parents who are on the call today might actually have had a viral vector vaccine. So this would be the AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson vaccines. So viral vector vaccines use a safe virus to carry some of the genes of the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID virus to teach the body how to recognize it. Next slide. So starting at number 1, scientists make harmless adenoviruses that deliver a short genetic code to your cells. Your body destroys the adenovirus after. The genetic code tells your cells to build the same kind of spike protein that COVID-19 has. This can't change your DNA. So you can see in a lot of ways, these are similar to the mRNA vaccines. Now, an adenovirus, what is that? So an adenovirus commonly causes colds and other mild symptoms. I'm sure you've had multiple adenoviruses in your life. Certain adenoviruses were chosen for this vaccine delivery job because they're modified so that they can't infect humans. So A good analogy for this is that the mRNA vaccine, you have to imagine it's like a zorb or like a bubble, kids blowing bubbles at the park, and the bubble is very fragile. So the mRNA is very fragile. We protect it in a bubble, and then we have to be very careful when we transport it. We freeze it at cold temperatures, et cetera. The viral vectors are more similar to, you've got that same information on the inside, but you put it in a bus, and then you transport it in a bus, and the bus protects the information, or a briefcase is another way of thinking of it. So the adenovirus vector is a hardy way, a sturdy way of transporting the information on how to make the spike protein. So just like the other vaccines now, once your body has made the spike protein, it starts to recognize it, builds a defense, launches an attack. You feel fatigue, aches, and a fever at this point. It's your immune system learning. Your body can now recognize the COVID-19 spike protein and fight off COVID-19 effectively. You're building immunity. Next slide. So we've got the two vaccines that are viral vectors, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. Now, these vaccines seem to have protection for the symptomatic illness, again, testing positive while having symptoms, mild, moderate, or severe. About 80% of people, give or take, 2/3, maybe 62 to 80% of people are protected from having mild, moderate illness from COVID with these vaccines. But upwards of 100% are protected from severe illness, hospitalization, and death with AstraZeneca. You'll notice Johnson & Johnson's protection is a little bit lower for that severe illness. Johnson & Johnson intentionally designed their trials to be a one-dose vaccine. It's quite possible if it was a two-dose vaccine that you would actually see the 100% protection against severe illness, hospitalization, and death. But what Johnson & Johnson did was give us data to say, if you just did one dose with this vaccine, what would happen? And we see that one dose has similar benefits for symptomatic illness, but we may not get the hospitalization protection that's as high. But for a lot of people who really hate needles, this might be the only way they're actually able to get vaccinated. And just like with the mRNA vaccines, it works well across different ethnicities and ages. Next slide. So what should I remember from the side effects? This is what I tell people when I'm giving the vaccine. 8 in 10 people complain of a sore arm, but only 1 in 100 call that soreness severe. 5 in 10 people complain of feeling tired and having a headache, but only 1 in 10 need Advil or Tylenol. So some reaction to the vaccine is expected, but most reactions are mild and can be managed at home. So what I advise people after I vaccinated them is, if you take something for a headache, normally Tylenol, Advil, whatever you prefer, it's okay to use that for a sore arm, body aches, a headache if you have those side effects of the vaccine. A lot of people talk about going to bed early the night they have the vaccine. They just are tired, over the weekend, and it does seem to be stronger with the second dose. So sometimes you can, have your first dose and go to work the next day, but with your second dose, it might be better sometimes to plan it to get it maybe a day before you have a couple of days off. Next slide. So can these vaccines be given to children? So as many of you are aware, the Pfizer vaccine was approved in early May for kids ages 12 years and older. So we can't give them. I have a daughter who's born in 2009, but she doesn't turn 12 until September. So she's not eligible for the vaccine in Ontario. She won't be eligible until it's approved for under the age of 12. So these were based on the phase 3 clinical trials from the US, which had over 2,000 adolescents aged 12 to 15 who received the vaccine. And there's trials ongoing right now. So these trials in particular started around October of last year, and we got the results and the approval in May. So the trials for kids 11 and under started in March, give or take. And so we're expecting those results to be coming end of August into September. When we're doing this, is a very common stepped process that we follow for other drugs and vaccines as well. So we start with the adults and then we look at kids. And usually these are dose finding studies. So one of the things we're looking to see with under the age of 11 is, what is the dose that will be used in those children? Will it be at a half dose? Will it be a third of the dose? We'll see. But that's something that we're waiting for end of summer. One thing that was really interesting is the Pfizer trials reported an efficacy of 100% in this age group, very, very effective in teens who have very strong, robust immune systems. We're hopeful that we will get similar approval for Mrna possibly in the next week or two. So we do know that Mrna has submitted the results for their pediatric trial. They're just a bit behind, and hopefully we'll see that they will be approved as well for kids 12 and up. Next slide. So what about side effects though? So this is something that wouldn't be terribly surprising. Side effects are a little bit stronger in teens. Teens have a stronger immune system. So the vaccine side effects for teens were more similar to people in their early 20s. So early on in the trial, ages 16 to 24, we knew they had slightly more side effects than say people who were in their 40s. Well, it's the same for teens. Teens seem to have them at a similar rate to those young adults. So we see that about 9 and 10 have a sore arm. And if you recall, for grown-ups, for those of you who already had your vaccine, the parents, about 8 and 10 would have had a sore arm. With teens, it's 9 and 10. About half of grown-ups have that fatigue, body aches, chills, etc. With teens, it might be closer to 7 and 10, 5 and 10 having chills, a quarter having a fever or feeling feverish. Other effects might include joint pain, muscle pain. So it's the same thing that I say, for teens that I say for older people. If you usually take a Tylenol for a headache, you're welcome to take that if you want it for the symptoms. It's also, if you get it this week, planning for the kids to have the day off school the next day may be reasonable as well. But there were no serious side effects in the trial, no Bell's palsy, anaphylaxis, low platelets, or deep vein thrombosis, for example. Next slide. So when we're talking about these regular side effects, these chills, body aches, things like that, it's your immune system learning to recognize the COVID vaccine. Some people feel their immune system learning more than other people. So some of you may have had these side effects with your first dose if you're the parents. Some of you may not have, and that's perfectly normal. You may have some fatigue, headache, achy muscles, chills, and a low fever, feeling slightly bad for a short time as you build immunity for a long time. Next slide. So who should not get the COVID vaccine? Well, people who have a history of a severe allergic reaction or an anaphylactic reaction to a specific ingredient in the vaccine or the vaccine itself. So having a peanut allergy, a shellfish allergy, any of those things, those are fine. Those have nothing to do with the vaccine. Even having a history of a reaction to a flu vaccine, for example, they don't share ingredients. So you're looking for allergies to specific ingredients. So with Pfizer, for example, we ask every person who comes in, do you have an allergy to polyethylene glycol or polysorbate? Those are two ingredients in the Pfizer vaccine. And if you had an allergy to that, you might be referred to an allergist. And so a lot of allergists are actually seeing patients now to confirm that they are allergic to the vaccine and to help them decide which vaccine they would need. So it's very unusual to be truly allergic to one of the vaccine components or the vaccine itself. And what a lot of family doctors are doing is referring patients to allergists in situations where that happens. Individuals who have received another vaccine in the last 2 weeks, we prefer to wait 2 weeks after a vaccine, like a tetanus shot or a shingles vaccine or an HPV vaccine. We wait 2 weeks to give the COVID vaccine. Partly they're due with the immune response. We want you to have a good, robust immune response to the COVID vaccine, but we also don't want you to get side effects to a shingles vaccine, HPV vaccine, or whatever, and then attribute it to the COVID vaccine. So we want them separated. Individuals under the age of 12, because it's not approved yet in Canada for individuals under the age of 12, even kids who are about to turn 12, the day you turn 12, we can vaccinate you. And people who have COVID symptoms, who will probably have the virus, and people who are ill from a different cause, we wait until you're feeling better and your immune system is ready just for the infection to clear to vaccinate you. Next slide. So let's talk about myocarditis, because I suspect that's what is on a lot of the minds of parents, especially the minds of boys, teen boys, or boys in their early 20s, men in their early 20s. So myocarditis has been coming up as a potential side effect for the vaccine, especially in younger men and teen boys. So there's a couple of places this data is coming from. There's a case series that was just published, a pediatric case series of 7 kids. They were all male, ages 14 to 19. In those cases, the myocarditis showed up 2 to 4 days after the vaccine. They appear to be mostly second doses. And the symptom is chest pain that often shows up, maybe some shortness of breath as well. All cases in this case series were covered. There's also data coming from the US CDC. So this was released on June 11th. 80% of cases that are being reported, and this was, there were over 400 cases. They're still confirming, which ones are actual cases versus, maybe someone called it that, but it actually wasn't myocarditis, for example. But 80% were male for the ones that they had some good information on, mostly ages 16 to 24. It was about 2 to 3 days after the vaccine. And for this, there'd be about 200 to 400 in 9 million doses. But again, they're doing a lot of work right now confirming that those are real cases. One of the challenges is when something like this comes up, when there's a question, people go looking for it. And what you have to confirm is, myocarditis happens. So for example, regular infections can cause myocarditis. COVID causes myocarditis. The multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, remember when we were so afraid of that, when we knew that kids weren't getting that sick from COVID, but they could get this multi-system inflammatory syndrome. Well, myocarditis and pericarditis are components of that. They can actually happen from COVID. So there's a real struggle right now. I think where we're all at is it's not clear the vaccine is causing myocarditis. There's been a signal that's come up. So the systems that we use to watch for serious or rare side effects is working because information has come in and a signal has come out. Now the job is for experts, pediatricians, cardiologists, epidemiologists, et cetera, to look at the cases coming in, confirm that they are in fact myocarditis, try and actually characterize what's happening here. We do believe most of the cases being reported are mild, and possibly because now people are going to look for them, so we want to see what happens. And they also appear to be largely tied to second doses, not first doses. And so this is probably not a question as much in Canada right now for the first doses that we're giving out, but this might be something that we want to have resolved by the time we're getting to a lot of those teen second doses in August. Does this impact, do we look for it differently? Does it change the dose that we're using? Something like that. So it's something to keep an eye on. I think it's worth watching the news. This is not a yes, no. We don't know indefinitely. We don't know for sure that the vaccines cause myocarditis, but we do know that a signal has come up through the systems. Now, I do want to highlight, this actually happened in the past once with polio. So polio was found to cause, the polio vaccine, the oral polio vaccine, was found to cause something called paralytic poliomyelitis, vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis, or VAP, in kids. It actually took them, it was 1 in a million kids who got the vaccine. Shortly after the vaccine developed this paralytic poliomyelitis from this live oral vaccine. So the good news was we could switch to an injectable, inactivated or killed vaccine, which is actually what we use now. But it took them 40 years to discover that that was happening. What's happened in the pandemic, what we've discovered is now we find these things in weeks. Our systems are incredibly powerful. All the countries around the world, the European countries, Israel is looking very closely at this. They have a lot of vaccines given out. The US is looking very closely at this, and so is Canada. So we do hope we'll have really clear information about this in the very near future. So just keep your eye on it. It's worth being aware of, but that recommendation, because COVID absolutely causes these things. There is risks to kids in getting COVID. We are seeing outbreaks when there's outbreaks in communities where it can actually spread through the kids. If all the adults are vaccinated, it still does spread through kids. So we really do have to weigh that. We're living in a pandemic, like it or not, and this is one of the risks of this infection as well. Next slide. So let's also talk for the parents at home who were they maybe had AstraZeneca first dose, have lived through these rare but serious side effects, in this case, the vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia, or VIT, and are now having to make a decision about their second doses. So I know this is about kids, but I want to just take a few minutes to talk about this with people who are over the age of 40 who are also in this position. So we know that this rare but serious clotting disorder emerged with AstraZeneca. Dose 1 risk appeared to be about 1 in 60,000. Dose 2 risk appears to be 1 in 600,000 right now. The clots were reported about 4 to 28 days after vaccination, again, mostly with the first dose. We do watch for all vaccine side effects, we watch for 6 weeks. So vaccine side effects show up within 6 weeks. People often are wondering about long-term side effects. Vaccines don't tend to have long-term side effects. You might get an early side effect from a vaccine that has long-term implications. So if you experience this vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia, someone might have a stroke from this and then have long-term symptoms of stroke. But vaccines themselves don't seem to have side effects that show up long-term many years out. Okay, so the clots here were reported between 4 and 28 days, and they develop through a mechanism that's different from other blood clots. So your body develops antibodies against your platelets, and it's a very complicated clotting syndrome. But we're now getting more mRNA vaccines, and so we have safer choices. So people who chose this as their first vaccine because they got vaccinated probably 1 to 2 months earlier, which was great, now are having the option of either choosing this for their second dose with a lower risk of it, or choosing an mRNA vaccine, Pfizer or Moderna. Next slide, please. So to give you some context on the risks versus benefit, if you look on the left-hand side, when the risk was high, when people were getting vaccinated with first dose AstraZeneca, the risk, the blues are hospitalizations and the blacks are deaths. On the right-hand side is the side effect risk, that vaccine-induced blood clots. You can see the benefits of the vaccine far outweighed the risks, especially for people over the ages of, say, 50, 60, 70, but still in that 40-year-old age group. There was still a lot of benefit there as well. Next slide, please. But now that you're moving on to your second dose, I just want to highlight that the University of Waterloo, we created some guides for people. We have this on the School of Pharmacy website. There's a one-page tool here to help you make your choices. There's also a 6-page patient-friendly document. You can read some of the evidence to help you make your choice between second dose AstraZeneca, Moderna, or Pfizer. The things to know is that we do believe that Moderna and Pfizer are possibly slightly more protective for the Delta variant. That does seem to be some of the data. There's also data emerging about mixing. So from the UK, Spain, and Germany, there's some studies on if you had AstraZeneca for your first dose and Pfizer for your second. It does seem to be tolerated well. There were some early reports that side effects might be worse, but actually that isn't consistent across all the countries. And so we're seeing, you know, it's probably pretty similar which one you choose. So again, if this is you, you're in this position, I encourage you to go to the website and take a look. Next slide. And this is just summarizing the vaccines in Canada. So we have AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. AstraZeneca is a 2-dose, Johnson & Johnson's the only single-dose vaccine we have in Canada that we actually haven't given any out. Almost all the vaccines protect almost entirely against severe illness, hospitalization, and death, which is what makes the pandemic so serious. You can see that for AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, they're not as effective for the symptomatic infection. So you might still get a mild cold or mild to moderate cold with them, cold symptoms, whereas you're much less likely with Pfizer and Moderna. So that we call that even, well, yeah, you're much less likely. They all offer some protection 4 to 6 weeks after the first dose. This was true of the earlier variants. With the Delta variant, one dose isn't as effective anymore, so that's part of the push to get as many vaccines out as we can to protect against the Delta variant. And then in terms of rare but serious side effects, we know about the vaccine-induced blood clots with AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, and right now there's this question about myocarditis, which is typically mild from what we can see in boys, teen boys, and young men, so probably the ages of around 15 to 24 in particular. Next slide. So why do children need to be immunized? Well, we do it to protect their health. You know, it's usually milder in kids, but we are getting some of these inflammatory symptoms. Long COVID happens in kids as well. So there are some complications that can happen from COVID. It's also to prevent transmission. So kids can pass the virus to other classmates, to their teachers, to their parents, to their grandparents. I know a lot of grandparents want to hug those kids. And so kids can pass the virus, right? To protect the community. So every child, every adult infected provides a chance for the virus to mutate. So that's where variants come from. When every person who gets infected could produce a variant. And then to return to in-person learning. So my grade 3 dropout can return to school again. And I'm sure many of you are living through a very similar version of what we're living through. Next slide. So can the virus still spread after vaccination? This is a common question. So when we're talking about long-term data that's needed, this is a great example of long-term research that we've been waiting for. So we know from Israel, after 2 doses, asymptomatic infection was reduced by 90%. So that means that you test positive with no symptoms, right? And that was scary early in the pandemic. People could be COVID positive and contagious, but have no idea that they're sick. So 2 doses did seem to reduce that by about 90%, which means those folks are not contagious because they're not infected. So it prevents people from getting infected without symptoms, meaning they're less likely to spread it. In the UK, where there's a lot of great research coming out of the UK, one dose of an mRNA vaccine or an AstraZeneca vaccine reduced symptomatic infection by 60 to 70%, and a single dose prevented spread by 50%. So there's this evidence and data showing rapid spread of the variants in households is another reason to get vaccinated. We know that's one thing we track. We can tell sometimes with variants where it used to be with the earliest COVID, one person in the household would come in, get tested, maybe test positive, maybe a couple of other people in the household would get it. With the variants, one of the things the docs at the assessment center would say was what changed is the whole family came in the car to all get tested together. It spread fast. So the variants being more contagious means it spreads in the house. So if we get people vaccinated and reduce the likelihood it spreads, even if someone in the house does get it, this is really good news for the potential to lift restrictions, for example. Next slide. Another big question I get is about pregnancy and fertility. So the Society of Obstetrics and Gynecologists of Canada does recommend the vaccine for pregnant and breastfeeding women. You'll remember in the third wave, pregnant women were a lot of pregnant people in the ICUs. Because pregnant people, when they get infected with viruses like the flu, and it turned out COVID, can get very sick very fast. So they're at much higher risk for severe disease, hospitalization, and ICU, and pregnancy complications. So sometimes they can be so sick that their preterm birth, low weight birth comes up, or even needing to deliver the baby early for the health of the baby and the pregnant person. So pregnant people are 22 times more likely to die compared to a pregnant person who does not have COVID. And there are no increases in miscarriage, preterm, or stillborn births with the vaccine. So there is research on the vaccine, especially coming from pregnant healthcare workers. The earliest people who got the vaccine were healthcare workers. So pregnant healthcare workers have been followed and are being followed, and it does appear based on their experiences that they're safe as well. It's also important to note that there's no evidence that vaccines affect fertility. I know this is all over the internet. There's no evidence that vaccines affect fertility. I want to emphasize that. There's no evidence that vaccines affect fertility. Next slide. So common concerns and questions. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, I'm not at risk of COVID. So COVID's highly contagious. This Delta variant is very, very contagious. It's spreading fast. Waterloo is not doing well with COVID. We are very much a hot spot in the province. We are very much at risk. Our community all of our communities continue to be at risk, but especially Waterloo. And there's a continued need for strict public health rules. And the longer we're at risk, the longer we will have restrictions. And in Waterloo specifically, the longer this will go on. So vaccines are the only way that this really ends. Next slide. So I already had COVID. Do I need a vaccine? Yes. So there's good research on this. People are researching this very closely. After your COVID infection, people do have some immunity. But the immunity can wane a bit, so it can fall a bit after a COVID infection. When a person who's had COVID gets a vaccine, they actually get a really good immunity boost. And so they get really robust immunity when you get a COVID vaccine after a COVID infection. So if you've had a COVID infection, absolutely get the vaccine. One of the future questions that's being asked, and this might come in the future, our second dose is needed. So right now we don't have data saying that, a COVID infection plus one dose is sufficient, but that's one of the examples, like the response is really good. And we are asking you to get your second dose, but what a great question. What is the response to a person who's had COVID plus one vaccine, for example? But with the variant, again, you need 2 doses. I'm going to emphasize that. And it is possible to get a COVID infection more than once, especially with the variants. Next slide. So do the vaccines work against the new COVID variants? Yes, but more information is needed. So all the vaccines are thought to work well against the Alpha variant, which is the one that was discovered in Britain, and the Beta variant, which was discovered in South Africa, after 2 doses specifically. A recent study suggests that the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines are effective against the Delta variant, which is the new variant circulating in Waterloo region that was discovered in India. Next slide. So this is Delta. This is coming from Public Health England, where some of the best information we have on vaccines and Delta are coming from right now. So what you can see is that an mRNA vaccine, the first dose, so Pfizer or Moderna, the first dose is 33% protective against symptomatic infection, so testing positive and having symptoms, whereas 2 doses are 83% effective. For AstraZeneca, it's 33% and 61%. So the numbers are pretty good for protecting. You still get with 2 doses protection, but this is where we've pushed up the second doses being a bit faster right now, especially in regions like ours, is that you really need that second dose. You get a much bigger boost with the Delta variant with the second dose than we had with the other variants. So in terms of hospitalization, you can see though, right off the bat with the mRNA vaccine, even with 1 dose, you have very good protection against hospitalization, excellent protection with 2 doses. With AstraZeneca, you have 71% protection for hospitalization with 1 dose, but even with a second dose of AstraZeneca, that jumps up to over 90%. So those who are trying to make that decision between, if I had AstraZeneca for first dose, do I choose Pfizer or Moderna or AstraZeneca, you can see for hospitalization, which is what really matters, both those options are over 90% protective. Next slide. So let's talk about needle fears. I grew up terrified of needles. I made it my mission to have children who would not be terrified of needles, but I see an awful lot of teens coming in the last week or so terrified of needles. So here's some strategies that can help as parents. And actually sometimes the parents can also be quite anxious coming in. So we are using a system called CARD. This comes from Sick Kids, a colleague of mine at University of Toronto, Immunized Canada as well. And so it stands for Comfort, Ask, Relax, and Distract. So make sure you're comfortable when you're coming in. Be prepared to ask questions if you need to. Right now is an opportunity to do that. Work on relaxation and have plans for a distraction. So next slide. So how to get comfortable? Eat. Please eat before you come. Eat. We don't need you passing out. Eat before you come. Have a snack, and have a snack after vaccination. Have a treat planned, right? Go out for something. A lot of McFlurries and things like that are being planned for the teens we've had coming through. Dress appropriately. Wear a short sleeve top or a top that your arm is easily accessible. Bring an item that brings you comfort. Whatever. They bring in, like people who are 18 bring in stuffed animals. It's totally fine. Relax your arm so that it's loose or jiggly like cooked spaghetti, and squeeze your knees together if you feel faint or dizzy. Teens love to faint. Teens faint like crazy, especially on a hot day where they've been standing in line. They have really strong nervous systems. They're kind of they're very alert, right? In your teenage years, you're very alert. So a vaccine, it's very common for teens to faint. And if you have one faint, then others will faint as well. So one of the easiest ways to prevent that is when you're getting the vaccine, you're feeling lightheaded, either when it's happening, before it's happening, or in the waiting area after, is to squeeze your knees together, or even to squeeze your arms or your fists. And you're trying to get blood back up to your face. You can do it for say 20 seconds. It works like a charm. So we're doing this in our clinic, and just, for parents, be aware as well. Like I say, teens love to faint. My husband is in his 40s. He still faints. It's totally normal. So questions to ask. What will happen at the appointment? Can I get the vaccine in a private space? Can I lie down to get the vaccine? We do. Lots of people need to lie down to get a vaccine. It's totally normal. We can absolutely accommodate that. Can I use a numbing cream or a patch to dull the pain where the needle enters the skin? I do this with my kids. I'll show you a picture in a minute. Can I bring a friend or family member? This is really important. We do see teens coming in on their own, and that's fine. If they want to come in on their own, that's fine. It's nice to have somebody with you sometimes too. Sibling pairs are wonderful. An older sibling has to be strong for the younger one, but can distract the younger one. So, if you need someone to come in, please bring someone. It's okay if you don't, but if you need someone, it helps. You can talk about what it feels like to get the vaccine. Very small needles we're using, very, very small needles for the mRNA vaccines. How to relax, so deep breathing, take deep belly breaths, slow breathing. You can do some positive self-talk, just saying, I can do this. Parents, we can do this. We can do this. It's going to be okay. We can do this. Having someone to support you, asking for privacy. We have private rooms in a lot of vaccine clinics or private spaces. And here's a big one. Please, please, please plan for a distraction. This works like a charm. And this is even, folks in their, guys in their 20s, having a phone, a video game, game, watching a TikTok video, YouTube. This works for grown-ups just as well. Reading a book or a magazine. If you can't focus on reading the book or the magazine, one thing you can even do is count the number of letters that have a hole in them. An A has a hole, a B has a hole, a D has a hole, and just count them. That can make a huge difference. Next slide. So numbing creams. Here's some tips for, oh, sorry, go back. Oh, and those were just distraction ideas. So funny sibling, conversation with parent, video game, music, reading, counting the letters, all of those things are fine. Next slide. So how to apply a numbing cream. So you can buy it at the pharmacy, they're over the counter. Ask the pharmacist to show you how to apply it. They can even use a Sharpie to put a spot on the arm so you can see it, but it's upper arm below the shoulder. So for me, it's right here. It's 2 to 3 finger widths below the bony part of your shoulder and then kind of underneath that. You apply it before you leave the house. Don't be surprised it can make your skin a bit pale or make your skin a bit red. That's actually kind of nice for the injector, so we know exactly where to go. We know exactly where the skin is numbed. Allergies to these things are rare, so a red spot doesn't mean an allergy. It's just a reaction. It's a normal reaction in the spot. Next slide, please. So you need to plan ahead though. So Mrna cream, I tend to find Mrna cream the easiest to find at pharmacies, but you do need to put it on at least an hour before you get there. So it's not in the car on the way there. You're putting on well in advance is important. Amatop is 45 minutes before you go. Maxilline is 30 minutes before you go. Next slide. And these are my kids. I have always done Mrna patches, always, always, always. That's both of them have them on their arms there. My kids, they don't even mind needles. That to them, one of my daughter, we were at a long vaccine clinic one day, big lineup of people in front of us. This was a couple of years ago. And this kid in front of us started just screaming. He was very upset. He was crying. And my youngest one said, his mom's probably not a pharmacist. So for me, that was a big thing because I see a lot of parents who have kids with needle fears who don't do this. So give it a shot if you can. If you want, the Mrna patches come in a patch like that already, but there's also other options. This, if you just Google it, this is a nice how-to guide from Alberta Health Services, interestingly, and it just walks you through how to put it on, where to put it on, and you notice in the right-hand side picture, once it's on with the bandage, the cream, they even wrap it in saran wrap just to keep it in place. And that just helps make sure that it's, where it needs to be when you get there. Next slide. So again, I mentioned about the fainting before. It's completely normal for teens to be fainting with vaccines. Most people grow out of it. Some people faint because they're nervous about vaccines. Not everybody's nervous about vaccines. Some people just faint. It's normal. It's more likely though if you are nervous about vaccines. So some of what I've talked about before can really help. But the other thing is just remember, you can sit in a chair, tense or squeeze the muscles in your legs or stomach, squeeze for about 10 to 15 seconds until your face feels flushed or warm, then release for 20 to 30 seconds and repeat steps 2, 3, and 4 until the needle is over or until the feeling of faintness passes. The volunteers in our observation room, after everybody waits for 15 minutes in the waiting area after the vaccine to watch for reactions. One thing they've noticed, the volunteers notice before the parents do. The parents will be on their phone and the kid beside them might be on their phone. The parents aren't watching the kids and the kid starts to pass out and the parent doesn't notice. It's the volunteer who notices. So you having a plan and just keeping an eye on this actually can be very helpful, probably for your child as well. Next slide. So if you get the vaccine, share it with others. People do find comfort in knowing other people also got vaccinated. Talk about your experience getting vaccinated. Be a role model. The goal here is really to bring the COVID-19 down to 0. Next slide. Or that might be the end of it. I think it's the end of it. So why don't we switch to questions now? Oh, there we go. Yes, this is our shot. That's right.
Thank you, Dr. Grinrod. That was a great explanation of the vaccines, their differences and effectiveness, and how to prepare for the vaccine. We do have questions. I did look at the Q&A section, and there's plenty of questions there waiting. Before we do get into the questions, For those who are interested in knowing where they can get a vaccine and how to book your appointment, we're just going to quickly review the registration and booking process. So I'm just going to pass it over to Carly Tithicott, who will be walking through that information for us.
Thanks, Jonathan. So as I'm sure you're all aware, youth between the ages of 12 to 17 are eligible in our region to receive a vaccine. As Dr. Grunrod mentioned, youth have to be 12 at the time of their appointment. And so eligible youth can pre-register on the Region of Waterloo website. When you're completing that pre-registration form, select youth 12 to 7 years of age as the priority group. Complete the form with the youth's personal information, and then you'll get a booking code, maybe by text or email, depending on what you indicated on the form. When your youth receives that booking code, family members that live in the same household can also use that booking code if they also haven't received their first dose. So we're encouraging family members and their youth to go together for their first dose if they haven't received it yet. If you need help filling out that form, there is a video with instructions on our website. You can also ask someone that you trust to help you, and you can always call us at the region at 519-575-4400 for support with that form or support in different languages. So we also like to know, Dr. Grunrod mentioned today in detail that the Pfizer vaccine is what's approved for youth to ages 12 and older. So youth in Waterloo region will be receiving the Pfizer vaccine. So we encourage you when you book your appointment for youth to book them at a clinic in our region that's offering Pfizer. So that's the Cambridge Pine Bush Clinic, Health Sciences Campus in Kitchener, and the Boardwalk Clinic. So youth are expected to get their second dose quicker than other people so that they have both shots before the 2021-2022 school year. If your youth received their first dose several weeks ago, you can fill out the rebooking form on our website because the youth are now eligible for that shortened second dose interval. Next slide. Okay, perfect. So the Waterloo Region Vaccine Task Force is hosting school vaccine clinics across Waterloo Region the week of June 21st, so next week, for youth and their families to get their first dose. Youth and family members they live with can book appointments at these school clinics to get their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. Daytime, evening, and weekend appointments will be available at these school clinics. The school clinics will not be taking walk-in appointments. An appointment is needed. So you can book an appointment by calling the YMCA, and their phone number is there as well as their email address. You can also stay tuned. There should be some communication coming out through school day tomorrow on how to book at these clinics if you prefer to go one of the school vaccine clinics rather than the mass vaccination centers that I just reviewed the pre-registration process for. I'll also note that free parking is available on site at all these school clinics. Perfect. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So I'll have Dr. Grunrod join me back again, and we'll get into some of the question and answers. So I just wanted to go over a few details before we get started. So there's been lots of questions submitted in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and I've been monitoring it and trying to sort of put them into different themes of questions that we're getting a lot of. If Dr. Grunrod did cover it in her presentation, I won't repeat those questions. And as Jonathan said at the beginning, we'll be talking about questions related to vaccine safety and effectiveness, but we won't be speaking to questions about school policies or return to school in September. We also got a list of questions from the 2 school board parent involvement committees that we'll also try to get through tonight. So if we do run out of time or we can't answer any questions, we'll follow up with information through the school board. So Kelly, I'll get started with a few questions for you. Lots of them were covered in your presentation, but there was some follow-up as well. So some people had some specific questions about the research, specifically around vaccination for youth, the size of the studies, the length of the studies, details like that.
Yeah, so the size of a study is going to depend largely on what you're looking for, right? So if you're looking for comparative effectiveness and, like the efficacy, effectiveness, safety, et cetera. So the studies were done in, thousands of kids. The pediatric studies are not as large as the adult studies because the adult studies were the ones that really showed us that the vaccines do work, right? That they are generally safe in adults, but they also do work. So we established that. With the kids, we're really looking a lot more at safety to a certain extent, but as we all know, safety is something we also have to keep looking at as more and more people get the vaccine. So as we all watch with AstraZeneca, sometimes you need hundreds of thousands or millions of people to get the vaccine before a rare but serious side effect emerges. And so that's exactly where we're at right now with the kids. So we have had, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of kids get the vaccines now. Now we watch. Because again, side effects show up within 6 weeks of the vaccines. And so I know this is a hard part for parents because we don't want our kids to be used as guinea pigs. So some people may actually willingly enroll their children in a study and be okay with willingly take the risks, and understand the risk benefit. But for other people, they feel very sensitive about this. They don't want their kids to be experimented on, right? So this is the concern. I hear this a lot, that this question, is this actually shown to be effective in kids? The studies, from what we've seen, we know it works in kids, possibly better than it works in adults. That's the one thing it showed us. We also know for the common side effects that we're seeing, the sore arm, the nausea, the headache, all of those kinds of things, we now know from those studies, they're similar, slightly more effective in kids. In teens, I should say teens actually, because we're really still waiting for the younger kids to have their studies done. Now we're looking for the rare side effects that show up, like this myocarditis signal that we're watching for. We're wanting to see, when it shows up. So things show up within 6 weeks, exactly as we'd expect. The myocarditis seems to show up within 1 to 3 days, 2 to 4 days of getting the vaccine. So that's exactly how we would expect side effects to show up. Again, side effects, this myocarditis, if it is a side effect, is mild. So now we watch with these, large numbers of kids getting the vaccines when these reports come up, what does it look like? So if this happens, for example, if a child, like a teen boy had chest pain after the vaccine, a couple of days later, they'd go to their family doctor. The family doctor would run an ECG. They do some blood work looking at some specific cardiac markers. And in most cases, they're mild and self-resolving. They might tell the kids, okay, take it easy for a month. That'll be the end of it. And that still gets reported to these systems, and that's the signals we're looking at. So now that's what we're waiting to see is, how, if it is serious, how often is it serious? It is, the cases we've had serious, is there anything that can predict that? Like, are these kids who had COVID before, so they had an even stronger immune response when they got their first vaccine dose or their second vaccine dose? Did they have a history of this? Did they have health conditions that can help us predict whether this was more likely? For example, did they have COVID and it was actually a COVID infection that caused this, or something like that? So those are the questions we have to answer. But as always, and I think people are learning about drug and vaccine research probably for the first time. Most people don't pay any attention to this. This is, all drugs go like this, right? And I think that's really important to note, that this is the normal process. Things have not been sped up. Things have not been too fast. What we've had is unprecedented investment into vaccines, so that we have incredibly well-run, efficient trials, incredibly strong, robust monitoring systems to watch for things, and the system is working exactly the way it should be working.
For that response, Kelly. We had another question about dose amount, and so people feeling a bit concerned or questions about, should the same amount of dose be provided to an adult versus a child?
Yeah, well, and you have to define what child is. So that's exactly what we're seeing is 11 and under, they're probably going to get a smaller dose. The pediatric dose, from what we can see, they have such good immune responses. With drugs, we always look for what is the effective dose. The dose goes up, more and more effect, bigger dose, more effect, and then you kind of plateau. Similarly, usually somewhere else, you could, as the dose goes up, more side effects, dose goes up, more side effects, and then you get kind of toxic and it plateaus. Those curves, as long as they're far apart, you want to get a good dose that's really effective, but nowhere near the toxic range of things where really bad side effects happen, right? So the good news is with kids and with teens, they had such a good response to the vaccine that you probably don't need as big of a dose under the age of 11, for example, and you can have a half dose and still get the same immune response. So I have that question. I think it's a good question to ask is, so for teens, maybe for a second dose, do they need a full dose for a second dose? I think a lot of us who work in this space are wondering, okay, myocarditis, it appears to be mild. The risk of COVID, it seems to be greater. There's some risks there, but does this change anything for the second dose? Well, that's interesting. Or maybe a future booster is a half dose, for example. Maybe that's where we see the change. So yeah, I think it's a good question. Do kids, and what are kids? Is a 12-year-old a kid, or is a 15-year-old a kid? Is a 24-year-old a kid? They have immune systems like kids. Where's the cutoff for that?
Perfect. Thanks, Kelly. The next question is about approval. So can you explain what the emergency approval process means versus a typical drug approval process, and what some of the differences are?
So one of the things that this emergency approval process did is that as the companies were doing the vaccine research, they were providing information to Health Canada as they went along earlier on. So that's part of what allowed it to be sped up, is that in a normal drug research, you've got your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is where you're kind of looking at initial dose finding, right? This is like what we've been talking about. Phase 2 is really looking at safety and also making sure that your early markers, it's working. Phase 3 is that big, robust clinical trial showing that it is, effective for clinical outcomes like hospitalizations and stuff like that, if you can. So that phase 1, 2, 3, how a trial normally works is you have an idea, you ask for a bunch of money, you get a little bit, you run a small study, phase 1, and then you get your results, and then you have to go and ask for some money, and then you get it. You can maybe run phase 2, takes a while, could take years. You have to recruit people. In a vaccine trial, they have to be exposed. Your placebo group has to get enough infections that you're trying to vaccinate against. There isn't a lot of that virus circulating. That can take a long time. You get into your phase, then you take your results, you go and ask for some money, you get into your phase 3, again, years. Now you might want to recruit thousands of people. It can take a long time to recruit them. What happened in the pandemic was bam, bam, bam. That happened fast. We had so much COVID in those placebo groups. The trials were done quickly because of the COVID. We could monitor. We monitored everybody for a couple of months after. We could do that. That was amazing. They could overlap them a bit. There was unprecedented money. People were clamoring to sign up for the trials. Recruitment was not a problem. As they were doing that, data sets were going off to Health Canada, the US FDA, the European Medicines Agency, all these different groups, the EMA, they were all looking in real time as the information was coming in. So where this is actually coming up is Novavax has just released its results. And in Canada, we don't necessarily need Novavax right now. It's looking to be a promising vaccine, but we have a huge amount of mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer. And so that might be the first COVID vaccine that we actually see go through the more traditional stepped process of submitting all their information and it all done at once. Maybe without the special meetings that are held, the emergency meetings that are held of all the same experts reviewing the data in all the same ways, but on a very more sped up timeline that the pandemic called for. The big difference is it's slower. Same processes for the emergency approval. It's a different how they organize it, but the same people, same processes, etc. The regular process is just a lot slower.
It has certainly changed a lot of the way we do things, so it's interesting how it's impacted the drug approval process in this situation. So the next question is about immunity. How long, and you touched on this a little bit, how long do you think immunity will last after both doses, and do you expect people to need a booster?
So the people who were first enrolled in the trials, the Moderna and Pfizer trials, were enrolled about a year ago now, maybe just closer to 14 months in some cases. So we have a year's worth of data on those earliest people a year ago. And we know that they seem to have pretty good immunity for that year. They're now testing variant boosters, so boosters that specifically target the variant. So more than anything, I think we will see boosters. I think we will probably see 1-year boosters. I think they're more a response to variants than anything. The question is, will we continue to need yearly boosters? And this is a separate conversation, I think, around the importance of actually sharing vaccine around the world. As long as wealthy countries vaccinate themselves, but the rest of the world can't access vaccines, variants will continue to emerge and wealthy countries will continue to need variant boosters. And so that's where there's been a lot of attention lately on making sure vaccines get out to the rest of the world to get COVID under control everywhere to stop the emergence of variants. So that's what the boosters are going to be about, more, not so much long-term immunity as variant immunity.
One of the next questions was, So youth are eligible for a shortened second dose in Ontario. Does that align with NACI's suggestions for optimal interval dosing for immunity?
Yeah. Yep. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were approved at 21 and 28 days. The time was really chosen more to get the trials done quickly. So it wasn't that 21 and 28 days is ideal. It was that you can do a trial faster if your two doses are closer together and you're not waiting 6 months, because the world needed the vaccines. And what we learned from AstraZeneca, in AstraZeneca's case, there was some benefit to delaying the second dose. It did seem to work better when you got your second dose of AstraZeneca closer to 12 weeks compared to 4 weeks. And so that was AstraZeneca. It's not there. It's probably a little bit of benefit in delaying the second Pfizer dose, say maybe 8 weeks versus 4. But with the Delta variant and the fact that you get such a better response from 2 doses, the Delta variant means that that earlier second dose outweighs any small benefit or boost you get from a slightly delayed booster. So what we're seeing kids go through right now is kids are getting their first dose right now. They're going to wait 2 months, give or take. In August, they're probably going to get their second doses, as far as I know, and that gets them their second dose, and maybe earlier in some cases, but that gets them their second dose at least 2 weeks before the school year starts. So all the kids who are 12 and up who want a vaccine can be fully vaccinated before they go back to school.
One question that I've been seeing a lot in the chat and the questions submitted before were the risk benefit, with a lot of people feeling like, what is the risk of children for COVID and the benefit of a vaccine that doesn't have long-term research, and sort of how you've been balancing those risk benefits for a population that some people feel wasn't as affected by COVID, or with hospitalizations and deaths, and sort of how you've navigated that risk and benefit.
Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is kids can be very affected by COVID, so they can get very sick. And so even cardiologists, pediatric cardiologists who are looking at this myocarditis risk, they have been treating myocarditis in kids who got COVID, right? So kids can get very sick. Kids don't tend to get very sick, but they absolutely can get very sick, and they can die from COVID. So I think that's important. I think another important thing to consider is that kids being out of school is a big impact. Home is not always a safe place for kids. There may be some kids watching this call who really are very independent kids, and school was the place that they went to eat, to access safety, to access their friends. And some kids, it's just hard. And I say this as a parent I have 2 kids. One is doing perfectly fine at home. One kid is not doing fine at home. And so I think we do need to consider that when kids are not vaccinated, the solution becomes to close schools when there's outbreaks. And so vaccination is what we are doing to keep schools open, to keep kids in school. And that's a huge benefit. So we have to be very careful about just considering health. But even if we strip away, okay, so fine, we get rid of school, kids can absolutely get very sick from COVID, and they can spread it to family members who can die from COVID. So I think we have to be careful that we don't underestimate the risk of COVID in children.
Thanks. Lots of questions too about spike proteins and the impact that the spike protein, the vaccine, has on the rest of the body.
Yeah. So this has been coming up as well. So the spike proteins are short-lived. So the vaccine is very short-lived. Like I said, the mRNA information, it comes in, it helps the body make some spike proteins. The body can recognize it, and then it gets rid of it. Your body doesn't shed spike proteins. One thing that happens when we're giving a vaccination, like any vaccination, and we're teaching the body how to recognize a virus, HPV, tetanus, or like a bacteria virus, anything like that, polio, any of these things, you can have a slightly inflammatory response or an immune response to the vaccine because your body is learning how to recognize it. You can get some of these side effects that we've talked about. I mean, certain things like this can happen. So an interesting one that I'm getting a lot from teen girls and young women is this going to affect my period? Because that's all over the internet. And it's a really interesting example of this. Your uterus lining, the inner lining of your uterus, is connected with the immune system because babies growing in uterus need to be protected by the immune system, right? So when you have an inflammatory response to something, getting an infection, a viral infection, can give you an unusual period. Getting a vaccination can give you an unusual period. So yes, after you have a vaccination, absolutely, you could have an unusual period, a bit heavier, a bit lighter. People are definitely reporting that. They report it with other vaccines though as well, and they also report it with infections. So I want to be clear about that. COVID has also long-term implications. There are long-term implications about getting infected with COVID. Viruses, infections with viruses can stick around for a long time. When we think of the herpes virus, when we think of the chickenpox virus and how it impacts you later in life with shingles, be very careful that, you know, I hear the same stuff that you hear online, things like the spike proteins, but don't underestimate viruses either.
Kelly, there's some questions about contraindications. So someone putting like, my child had their spleen removed, my child has epilepsy, my child has a chromosome disorder. Another question about allergies to penicillin. I know you talked a little bit about contraindications to the vaccine, but I'm not sure if any of those.
No, so the penicillin allergy, that's fine. That's totally fine. For some of the other ones, I would say talk with your family doctor. A lot of Mrna is going out to family doctors right now, so you might even be able to get, when it's approved in children, for example, you might be able to get your kids vaccinated there. But for the Pfizer vaccine, you can call your doctor beforehand, call your specialist beforehand. Conditions don't necessarily impact response to the vaccine. There are some conditions, immunosuppressing conditions, where you might not get as robust a response to the vaccine, but you also have a suppressed immune system, which puts you at risk for complications from a virus. So, you know, some conditions that might impact your response would include autoimmune conditions, HIV, concerns like that. So, you know, we still encourage getting the vaccine. Others would be treatments for autoimmune conditions, things that suppress your immune system. Taking oral steroids, for example, for severe asthma, Crohn's and colitis, conditions like that. Again, you're better off getting vaccinated because your immune condition and your suppressed immune system means you are at risk, but you might not have as good of a response to the vaccine. So it's really important in families where there's someone who has an immunosuppressing condition who can get vaccinated but might not have as good or strong a response to the vaccine, that everyone around them, for example, when we're talking about kids in classrooms, having the class vaccinated to protect kids like that is really, really important.
Lots of questions about myocarditis, but I know you've talked to that a little bit already. I wanted to bring a few of them to your attention. So like, what does treatment look like for myocarditis? Is there any permanent damage? Is there any other risk factors that would put someone at higher risk of having this side effect? Yeah.
Yeah, so risk factors and things, that's the questions to ask, you know, is this kids who are otherwise healthy, or is this kids who have a history of this? Treatment is usually rest, NSAIDs like ibuprofen, things like that. So I wouldn't take them to prevent it or to think it's going to do any prevention, but, you know, anti-inflammatories. Myocarditis refers to inflammation of the heart muscle. And so, you know, it happens again with infections, and oftentimes when it's happened, you may have no idea that they had just mild myocarditis. But when we know about it, there are, you know, different treatments, normal treatments like that, because it does happen for sure. Not even necessarily with the vaccine, just in general, it happens, and it's treated the same way. If this is a vaccine-associated side effect, it will be treated the same way as regular myocarditis, viral-induced myocarditis, for example.
Can you speak a little bit to the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine versus COVID? Like, I know you said that it's a risk in both situations, and I don't know if numbers might be hard to put to that, but like how
it's too early for numbers to be, and you have to weigh the risk when it depends on when there's a lot of circulating virus versus not. So in Waterloo region, where we're having the Delta variant, where we're on the news as being the region to watch in the province, our risk is higher than another region, maybe a northern community that has no virus. So that's always changing, but no, we don't have a sense just yet. We go through this in other cases. So another parallel example is the risk of Guillain-Barre with flu shots, for example. Guillain-Barre is a rare but serious nerve condition, causes kind of a progressive paralysis that can, you know, that eventually does recover and go away. But the flu shot can cause it in about 1 in a million. But a flu infection can cause it in about 10 in a million. And so sometimes you're weighing that. So that's a question we have to ask, is how common is myocarditis in young, you know, teen boys and young men? And how common is myocarditis in that same population, because it does tend to occur in young men and teen boys when they get a COVID infection? It's a great question.
Lots of other great questions coming through. Someone had, like, we're not going to talk a lot about what return to school looks like, but someone had questions about, like, what will life look like for kids specifically after kids are fully vaccinated? And, like, we can't speak to the specifics of school, but I don't know if you can speak to what precautions will still need to be in place.
Yeah, this is something that we're all anxiously waiting for from Public Health Agency of Canada and other groups like that. When will masks come off? It's quite likely that we'll be masked for a good chunk of the summer. You know, the first thing that will likely be lifted is masks outdoors, and then eventually will be, you know, smaller groups and then larger groups unmasking indoors. And I'm finding, you know, this is a real challenge in our house where my kids 9 and 11 can't be vaccinated. So as people around them, grandparents are getting vaccinated, parents are getting vaccinated, adults, some of their classmates, my 11-year-old, half of her class will have been vaccinated. And so, you know, does she stay unmasked? And we don't really have guidance about that. Eventually, this will go away. Eventually, life will return to normal. But the faster people are vaccinated, the faster that happens. I will say I do find it a challenge as someone, you know, a parent of children who cannot be vaccinated, that those around us who are getting vaccinated do forget that sometimes. And so reminding grandparents, okay, everybody here is vaccinated, but my kids are not. So we have to be careful. And I think, you know, I suspect many of you at home are going through something similar.
We have one question about exercising after the vaccine. Is it okay to exercise right after
Yeah.
you receive the vaccine?
Oh yeah, you bet. Yeah, and one of the pieces of advice for a sore arm, after you vaccinate, you know, you can move your arm around, you can put some ice on it, you know, take a Tylenol if you want. Absolutely, you could go and exercise if you wanted, and if that feels great, you could walk to the vaccine clinic and walk home. I mean, any of those things are totally fine.
There's some questions about what the consent process is currently in place for youth, and what parents' role is versus the youth role is in that process.
Well, right now with 12 and older, we're getting into the age where kids can really consent for themselves, and it's important to, you know, the parents are there. The majority of the time, the parents are there, and it is important to ask the kids. You know, so I'll go through, I'll ask, you know, contraindications, like, do you have allergies to polysorbate, polyethylene glycol, all that kind of stuff. And you usually, especially the younger groups, you do need the parents there if the kids don't know or if they're afraid. But we always, you know, stop and say to the kids, do you consent to this? Are you okay with this? So we're concerned both ways, right? You know, I think parents sometimes raise the concern that, well, I don't want my kid to be able to get the vaccine without my consent, but then they might also not realize not all kids have parents who can consent for them. Not all kids live in a home where the parents are able or willing. It's not that they're against vaccines, but they might work multiple shifts. They might have multiple jobs. They can't get a kid to the vaccine clinic. So we do see lots of sibling pairs where the older siblings coming in, you know, maybe they're 17 or 18, and then the younger child. And we do go through the process with, you know, the kids to make sure that they are comfortable and can consent.
Seems like we've also got some parents that are thinking ahead to that younger group. And do you have, I know you've talked a little bit about Moderna being approved in the near future, but what are your expectations or what do you see sort of on the horizon for kids under 12? And I know some people had questions about, do you expect it to be similar to the US and it's starting with 7 and over first, or how do you see that happening here in Canada?
It's a good question. They may well tie it to school. I'm not sure how it's going to roll out. I think the first thing that has to happen is probably August or September. The approval will come through for kids because those studies will be done to show us, you know, what the appropriate dose is and what the side effect, a common side effects, the ratio is to watch for, things like that. I think that's the first step. I am anxiously awaiting this. My 9-year-old has decided she's getting her ears pierced in celebration for getting her vaccine when she gets it. But it'll probably be early fall. So a lot of the kids, you know, 11 and under will be going back to school, most likely unvaccinated, and they will be vaccinated during the school year, that first term. So something I've often told people is, I know we're thinking it's going to be a normal September. Pandemics last years. The closest really when things will feel the most normal is probably the new year. And I can't speak to what school is going to be like, but I say this with my kids, things will probably not feel all that normal until we're getting into the new year, right? When everybody's had a chance to get a vaccine, who wants one, when it's really taken effect, when the numbers are really low, all of those kinds of things. That's probably when we'll start to see the most changes and things opening up.
To get that insight. Some people wondering too about, similar to what you mentioned, a kid that's born in 2009, do you expect that approval will come at the same time as that younger group?
I suspect, yeah, unless the medical directive comes through, say, at a provincial level. Some provinces have had kids born in 2009. That's come through a special directive that the province issues to say, okay, we know this is off-label prescribing, right? So these kids are not technically covered, but they are turning 12 this year, so we accept that. That's actually special, and we don't have that in Ontario right now. So for that reason, and unless something like that comes in, our kids, 11-year-olds like my daughter who turns 11 end of September, she's not getting vaccinated until it's either approved or end of September. Sorry, she turns 12 end of September.
We have a question about why does a second dose reaction seem to be more severe than the first dose?
Well, your immune system's primed. So with your second dose, it's a reminder to your immune system. With the first dose, your immune system's seeing it for the first time. With the second dose, this is a way of just popping up that immunity just a little bit more. That reminder does seem to elicit a slightly stronger reaction. Now, so talking to parents who got AstraZeneca, the second AstraZeneca dose does not seem to have as strong of an immune side effect profile, especially when those two doses are closer together. Further apart, I suspect they're more even. But with the mRNA vaccines, you do seem to get your initial response, and then you get a good boost. And with that boost, you have slightly stronger side effects. Again, they're your immune system learning, so your immune system already knows a bit more, and it's learning more that second time around.
There's one question again about the myocarditis. What percentage or what occurrence rate does there have to be for it to be stopped, like similar to what we saw with AstraZeneca and blood?
Well, I don't know. I think that's the question here, because we went through this with, everybody's just gone through this with AstraZeneca too. What was the point? And in Canada, for example, 1 in 60,000 we've said is not acceptable. But if you're in India, where a lot of the AstraZeneca is going, or other countries where there's outbreaks, and they've got the Delta variant, 1 in 60,000 is actually really okay compared to the risk of the virus. So you have to always consider that in the context of the risk. And I don't know, but I think that as more information comes out, we will learn more about that.
A question about, you had discussed before, like long-term impacts, long-term effects, side effects of vaccines, and typically we see short-term effects, and some questions about mRNA technology being new and like how that plays into short-term versus long-term effects of vaccines.
Yeah, I really struggle with this because there's a lot of this online, but a lot of this is also stoking fear, right? And again, I want to always start with a caveat. COVID has long symptoms. COVID has long-term impacts, so we cannot move past that. The mRNA technology is new, but it has been around for, it's been studied, it's been looked at for, a long time now, for a decade now, looking at different potential uses from it. Same with the viral vector vaccine. There's actually an approved viral vector vaccine, an Ebola vaccine uses the viral vector strategy. So I understand the concerns. And it's hard because I don't think there's more that can be said about that. With vaccines, we don't tend to see long-term side effects. We see things show up in the first 6 weeks. We have no reason to think it would be any different with the mRNA vaccines, but we are using the mRNA technology to prevent the infection of a virus that does have long-term implications. And we don't know how long people are going to continue to have problems with, post-COVID infection. So I think we have to be very careful. I think this does fall for a lot of people into that territory of I'm not at risk of COVID. If you underestimate your risk of COVID, you may also underestimate your risk of long-term side effects of a COVID infection. So I just be very careful with that is all I'd say. Make sure that you're considering both sides of that coin.
Sorry to interject. I just wanted to mention that we have 4 minutes left in our allotted time for the session. We do have some additional questions, and looking at them, there's some really important, great questions in there. And for those that can stay a bit longer, Dr. Grinrod has kindly agreed to answer some additional questions for the next 15 minutes or so. So if you do have to leave, thank you for joining the session, but we're just going to continue on with some last few questions before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think we only have about a few more to get through. Some questions about children that would have been infected with COVID previously, checking for antibodies. Is that a different approach to vaccination? Or if someone has been infected with COVID, how long do they need to be waiting for their first dose?
So if you have been infected with COVID, wait until you feel better to get your first dose. So probably a couple of weeks, you know, when you're done quarantine and all that, or isolation, all of that stuff, then get your vaccine dose then. For kids, really, even people who have been infected with COVID, you get some immunity, you get some immune protection, you get much better immune protection with the vaccine. It's much more reliable, it's much more robust protection. So it is important, even if you've had a COVID infection, that you still get a COVID vaccine.
Okay. I think that's about it in terms of questions. I don't know, Dr. Grinner, if you have anything else that you want to add or frequently asked questions that come to your mind, but I think that this is about it from our chat and the questions that were submitted previously. Thanks so much for the group for being so engaging. There's so many questions here. It's great to see.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grinrod, for answering all of our questions and for your informative and enjoyable presentation. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us and for all the great questions that you provided to make this presentation meaningful and helpful. We encourage people to book an appointment. We want to have youth vaccinated for a safer 2021-2022 school year. So thanks for your continued efforts to keep our community safe, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.